we're going to be talking about Gothic subcultures. The reason, why, you might wonder why I would be talking about Gothic subcultures in a British Lit class. Well, first of all, the origins were in Great Britain. But second of all, I want you to see that what was going on in the Romantic period in the early 1800s echoes even now in the modern day. And there's no better way to see that than to look at the subcultures that exist today. See, wow, the things that people were writing about, singing about back in the early 1800s is almost the same that people are still talking about and singing about now. So, when we look at subcultures, we're going to be talking about two specifically. We'll be talking about the Goths and the Rivet Heads. Now, there are other subcultures. I'm just going to talk about two of them. Now, obviously, in any subculture, you're going to have variations. You're going to have people who might be both Goth and a Rivet Head. You might have people who only like it because it looks cool. You might have people who are really hardcore into it. I'll tell you. That's a good question. What's a Rivet Head? I will fully answer that question, guarantee you. Okay, so, understand when I talk about subculture, I'm only talking about the main core beliefs and values of this group of people. But it's not to say everyone in there embraces all those bullet points. You see what I'm saying? But I want to give you an understanding of where they came from and what they stand for. So first I'm going to talk about Goths, then we'll take a break, and then I'll talk about the Rivet Heads. So let's hit the Goths first. Goths are probably the most familiar. Okay? Raise your hand if you've heard, raise your hand if you know of a Goth personally. All right, good. Okay. Raise your hand if you know of a Rivet Head. All right, less hands on that one, right? So we're going to talk about the most common one, which is the Goths. I found this on a website. I thought it was pretty entertaining. I think it's very true. This speaks to a lot of the stereotypes of Goths. Goths don't always wear black. They don't worship Satan. They are not evil, although I would argue they love to think they're evil, but they're really not truly evil. They don't want to kill people, even though one of these so-called Goths did kill some people in a high school, the Columbine shooting. But that doesn't mean that guy was a full-on Goth. He was an adolescent who was trying to be a Goth, maybe. And he went a little bit too overboard on that. Generally speaking, they don't hate everybody. In fact, Goths might be more accepting of people and their differences than other groups. They're not always depressed.
Not always?
No. People think Goths are just depressed. I know, and people get Goths confused with emo. Okay? In fact, Goths, when it says they don't hate everybody, they should put a clause in there, except emos, because people get them confused. Even the way emos dress, their music, it's completely different.
Oh, I thought it was the same. Even
their roots are different. That's why they hate them, because they hate getting confused as to being them, and it's a total misunderstanding. They can be happy. I have some pictures. They look pretty happy, right? These Goths right here, they look pretty happy. They're usually nice. A lot of them are normal. A lot of them don't dress like this day in, day out. They might just do it once in a while or something. They could be anybody, right? It could be. What makes them Goth? Good question. What makes them Goth? We will get there. So, I get what you're saying, right? Well, they're normal in the sense that, psychologically speaking, they're just like regular people. Okay, so. A word that you need to know as I get into subculture is the word aesthetic. So I'm throwing a vocabulary word at you. Aesthetic is basically a principal set of style that, a particular person, It could be a group of people like Goths, or even a culture. And there's a certain look to things. Okay, like if I walk into P.F. Chang's, there is an Asian aesthetic. The way the roof is, the way the menus are, the font on the menu, the way they might dress. And now you can even go further and say, oh, this is Chinese. It's not just Asian, it's actually very Chinese. Whereas I can go and do a sushi place and it looks Asian as well, but the aesthetic could be quite different. I might see more bamboo or more painted characters, which makes it more Japanese. So aesthetic is that principal set of how things should look. Okay? And so when we talk about the subcultures, each has their own aesthetic principles. That's what makes Goth Goth. So what is the Gothic aesthetic? Well, the Goth aesthetic combines elements of both romance and horror. Now, on the scale between what I call beauty and horror, okay, the perfect Goth tries to ride the line directly in the middle. But see, that's the whole fun of it, because that's difficult to achieve. Wannabe Goths tend to fall more on the beauty side or even on the horror side. At what point does it stop being Gothic? Well, when it's too beautiful or it's too horrible to be Gothic. So let me show you what I mean. Let's slide the scale all the way down to beauty. At this point, it's not going to be Gothic at all. Let's get a nice, beautiful red rose. Nothing Gothic about it. It's romantic, beautiful, it's very nice. Okay, now what if I slide the scale all the way down to horror? All right, let's talk about the rose. What about the rose? And I slide the scale to horror. We're going to kill the rose. It's dead rose. A bloody rose? How about this? There's that part of the rose that I don't like. It's the thorns. Okay? And when the ladies get roses for Valentine's, hopefully they took the thorns off. Okay? Why? Because that's sort of the horror part you don't want. You just want the beauty, right? I remember I was a young guy, and I'm afraid because I'm putting this on YouTube.
That is a true
story,
Do you have a
man.
knife with you or what?
Oh, no, I didn't have a knife. So anyway, I'll take that off the record. I don't want anyone ever finding out that was me. So anyway, horror. That thorn, man. That thorn was that part of the rose I didn't want. So that's the horror side. So what happens if we go right into the middle? What do we get now? Something a little more Gothic, right? A black rose. Good, good. Something like, here's a red rose, but we're going to add some sort of horror elements. So what you see there are drops of blood, but they're represented as a black pattern. We might also find a black and white picture where we killed the color, but then we just kept the beauty of the rose. Okay, here's another example. Here's a black rose with a skull on it. But the skull is made out of these beautiful, dazzling little diamonds. So do you see where horror and beauty try to combine? And it's fun when we try to see how can we combine the two. Okay, so you can see it's kind of fun when you try to ride this line. We might find a ring like this. So you have the rose, which is black, but then it's got these diamonds and a drop of blood. But it's not horrific. It's been turned into something beautiful. So you might find a perfect white ceramic rose and then throw a bunch of blood on it. But in an artistic way, to where it looks like paint. It doesn't look like someone actually, cut their lip and bled on the rose. That's gross. So you got to make it look good and yet have a little bit of this darkness there. So that line is where the aesthetics are. Now, where did this all even start? Arguably, I would say it was not the 1980s, but like the 1780s in the early Romantic period. But if we're going to look at the modern Gothic movement, it would be in England in the early 1980s. Now, the punk rock scene, these were rebels of their time. They didn't want to go with the mainstream. They were the punk rockers. They weren't goth yet. Goth was sort of a offshoot of the punk rock scene. Post meaning after. So it's sort of after the initial wave of punk rock, there was the post-punk scene, which is the early 80s. This guy right here, a bunch of skinheads probably. Now, this guy, he's not goth at all. Which side do you think? Is he towards the beauty or the horror side? Horror. Yeah, it's going to be more on the horror. And even the rock scene was filled with a lot of more horrific images, not really beautiful images. But then, from there, musicians were looking at this and saying, we like, the rebelliousness of it all, but let's put in a little bit more beautiful elements into it. And so you get a band kind of like The Cure from the 80s, which some people would say were the godfathers, one of the godfathers, or many, of the goth scene. Now, here's the key. In a modern Gothic sense, they are not referred to as a Gothic band, and they never self-proclaimed themselves to be Gothic. But what they did is they were one of the first musicians to ride this spectrum between beauty and horror, where the band sound was inconsistent. On one hand, one song would be super happy and just on the beautiful side. But then another song is completely depressing. And so because they were able to bounce between the two elements as a band, they started to open up people's minds. That, hey, we can make music that's kind of both. It's kind of happy, but it's also got this moody side to it. We don't all have to be one sound. We can be diverse as a band. And so they kind of started the ball rolling with what would soon become Gothic music. Since that time, goth music has splintered into its own subcultures. Call it like subculture. Okay? So they're all considered what you would say Gothic, but each has their own style of what Gothic is. So on the one hand, you got this band up there that they're more like a Gothic metal. So they're going to verge on the horror side of things. Then you have electronics were introduced. So in the late 90s, even now, you have Gothic electronic type of music. And so you might have only two people in the whole band, or even just one person. Because it's mostly all electronics, right? And then you have a return to the medieval and Renaissance aesthetic. Just like in the Romantic period, when they're trying to bring the medieval times back, in the Gothic world, they were doing the same. Where let's all dress like we're in medieval times, and let's all play medieval kind of music. And that's a Gothic thing as well. And then you have more popular bands like Evanescence, who, through their popularity, stopped becoming Gothic. I would say they're more of just a female rock band at this point. But when they first started out, there's an album called Origin, which is out of print, so you can't buy it. You have to find it. I think it's freely available, though, because they know it's out of print, so they made it so you could just download it. But that's a very Gothic album. There's like a song on there, it's nothing but rain, and then a song where it's like a school choir singing, and then these guitars start kind of swirling in. So that kind of Gothic sound is very prevalent at their roots. My point being, the goth music scene has splintered into many categories. And finally, in the middle, you have this return to the Victorian era, but it's with this, so that's beautiful, all the dresses and things like that, but then with the macabre. So if this woman had worn this exact dress in the Victorian era, people would think she was mourning the loss of a loved one. But in reality, she probably thinks the dress is just really cool. So the goth has sort of embraced Victorian fashion as well. So what is goth? It's a hard question these days. It depends on what level of the spectrum we're talking about. And so if I were to take goth music and lay them out on the beauty and horror scale, we might find something like this, where in the middle you kind of have your goth synth, which is electronics. Use traditional rock band instruments. You have goth rock. Start making the guitars more aggressive and grinding. You got like gothic metal. But how is gothic metal different than regular metal? Well, just put in really beautiful female vocals. And now you have gothic metal. You see? You have to have that beauty in there. Also, then it goes to just noise, which isn't music anymore. Now, I'm not talking about banging pots and pans and making a soundtrack. I'm talking about, I have one album where the last 4 songs is nothing but wind. And about like every so often you hear an owl screeching, or you'll hear some rumbling thunder. And that's it. That's 4 tracks of just noise. So there we're kind of on that horror side of the house. Let's move up. Gothic synth, as we go more towards the beautiful, you have dark wave. Dark wave is when they use classical instruments. So now violins and cellos and the bass, but instead of sounding something like Beethoven, it's more something that's very emotional. It's definitely doesn't sound like classical music at all. And yet it's using classical instruments to create that same feel. Folk music is a little bright and cheery, but it's medieval. And they might be bright and cheery singing about the Black Plague. So there's that beauty and horror mix there. And finally, ethereal, which is still considered Gothic music. But what ethereal is, it invokes a feeling of heaven and like angels and stuff. I'm not talking about a song you would sing in church. It's more like guitars that are layered, heavily layered, that swirl in and out, angelic voices layered and echoey, and it just sounds like a heavenly vision. But there's something eerie about the whole thing. So that's why it's still considered Gothic. But it's going to be more on the beauty side. Now, record albums, labels, as they call them, like Project Records. Hey, it was started off by a couple people during their college days. They loved this kind of music. They played the music. The guy's girlfriend was a photographer at the time, so she did all the cool cover art. She was photography major, rather. And so they came together and they started making dark wave music. So what we see in the 90s is labels starting to emerge that cater to certain crowds of people. So goth became such a big word now, where it's actually more specialized. If they had record stores anymore, you could ask the guy, hey, I want some Gothic music. Now that's a very difficult question to ask. Okay, because it's so diverse. Now, some people think maybe goth music's dead. I tell you, it's alive and well, doing well even since the 80s. Every year they have an annual festival. Even if you're not into Gothic stuff, you should go anyway, because it'll give you something to talk about, that's for sure. Exactly. It's the Wave Gothic Treffen, which means gathering. It happens in Germany every year, and at the last one, it usually lasts about 5 days. It's a concert that's like 5 days long. Last year they had 150 bands play. What? And it's not like expensive or anything. You just had to more pay for lodging, and some people stay in tents, as you can see. It's not America, man. It's Germany. You can get away with a lot more over there. Over here, you set up a tent. The police will pick you up, right? Hey, it's Germany, man. So come on. It's Germany. You see a lot of weird people. You definitely would have something to talk about when you got back to the States. it would definitely open your mind to other possibilities, that's for sure. You can go to their website, and they have photos from a lot of the years that they've been there. It's so popular that one of the years, they actually ran out of money. And they couldn't pay the bands, and they couldn't pay the police, they couldn't pay the people running this thing. They just ran out of money after the 3 days. And so they told everyone to pack up and go home. Concert's over. Nobody wanted to leave. And they stayed for another 2 days, and the other band, the rest of the bands that didn't play yet, they played for free. And the cops went home, and there was not one violent outburst the entire time. So, you know, it's just a great fun that they have. It's not known as being a drug scene. It's more just this sort of fantastical fantasy kind of thing. So, we'll take a break. After that, I'll come back and talk about rivet heads.
They look kinky.